Hello viewers, in this tutorial we are going to talk about local listener and dynamic as well as static registration of database instance or services with the listener. As a DBA, you might already aware of the relationship between the instance and the listener. This video is to show a few more related aspects in this context. To better explain the relationship between the local listener and instance registration, let's take an example of our test database named redtest1. And this is an Oracle 19c database, and from the same Oracle home, there is also one listener running named listener_19c. And this listener is listening in the port 1522. Now let's understand what is static and dynamic registration of an instance or service with a listener. A static registration is when you supply or hardcode the information about the instance to be registered in the listener configuration file, that is the listener.ora file under the Oracle Home Network Admin directory, then it is called static registration. And when PMON process of an instance supplies the information about the instance to be registered to the listener, then it is called dynamic registration. To better understand this, let's first check the status of our listener named listener_19c. So lsnrctl status listener19c, and we see the listener parameter file, that is listener.ora file under the Oracle Home Network Admin folder. And if we see the contents of this file, we'll see that the first part is the description of the listener, its port and the protocol, etc. And the second part, that is SID list, name of the listener. And in this section, we can see different instances which are statically registered with this particular listener. For example, the redtest1 instance is the only instance registered with this particular listener. But when the PMON process associated with the instance is responsible for providing the information to the listener, then you actually don't have to make this static entry in the listener.ora file. And I'm talking about this PMON process associated with our instance redtest1. Now let's check what are the information that PMON process provides to the listener. The PMON process is responsible for providing the name and status of the instance, the name of the database services that are associated with the instance, and the database server mode, that is whether it's a dedicated server or in shared server mode, and also the load on the instance to work on certain load balancing activities. So obviously, dynamic registration through the PMON process is much more versatile than static registration because it passes many useful information to the listener. Now, as we did a static registration by making a hard-coded entry in the listener.ora file, let's check the instance status shown by the listener. And if we do a lsnrctl status listener, then we can see that in this line, the status of the instance redtest1 is shown as unknown, whereas we can see that the instance is well up and running, but the listener doesn't know about the correct status of this instance, and that's the reason it is shown as unknown. So when we do a static registration of the instance with a listener, the listener actually doesn't have a way to find out the exact status of the instance, whether it's running or not. Next, we will remove the static entry in the listener.ora file and restart the instance to see if the PMON process dynamically registers the instance. So let's go to the listener.ora file and we will remove this second part in the listener.ora file that tells the listener about the instances to be registered. Save this and we'll restart the listener, and then we will restart the instance also. Start the listener, and now we can see that there is no services of the instance registered with the listener now. Now we'll also restart the instance. This is our instance. We'll shut it down. The instance is shut down. Now we'll start it up. Now let's go and check the status of the listener again. And it is not showing any instance registered with the listener yet. The PMON process usually provides information related to the instance to the designated listener every 60 seconds. But in this case, even after waiting for 60 seconds, the listener is not showing any registration of the services related to the instance. Next, we will change the port of the listener to 1521. Currently it is 1522, and we'll change it to 1521, which is the default port of an Oracle listener. And then we will restart the listener as well as the instance to see if the PMON process dynamically registers the instance. Instead of restarting the instance, you can also check by simply waiting for 60 seconds and see if the PMON process automatically and dynamically registers the instance with the listener. Now first, stop the listener and open the listener.ora file. Then change the port to 1521, save it, and start it. And this time the port used by the listener is 1521. Now we can wait for 60 seconds to see if the PMON process dynamically registers the instance with the listener. Let's check it again. Status listener, and yes, we can see that the instance information is there, and the services redtest1.manage.home, that is the global name of the database instance, is registered with this particular instance, and the status is shown as ready. So we can see that when the listener is using the default port 1521, the PMON process is able to dynamically register the instance with the listener. But it is not always the case that you will have the default port 1521, because there are many security related risks of using default features. Then what you will do? Say your port is 1522. There you have to set the local listener initialization parameter to either the description of the listener or a TNS entry that points to the description of the listener. So let's change the port of this listener back to 1522 and see how it goes. Let's first stop the listener, modify the listener parameter file, change it back to 1522, and start the listener. And we see that there is no registered instance in this listener yet. Now what we can do to get the instance dynamically registered with the listener? We have to set the local listener parameter of the instance. Next, we'll connect to the database as sys and check the parameter local listener. This is currently blank, so we'll set it local listener equals to this description of the listener within single quotes, scope equals to both, and the local listener parameter is set. Now the PMON process should be able to dynamically register the instance or the services of the instance with the local listener. Now check the status of the local listener again, and yes, we can see that the service redtest1 manus.home with instance redtest1 is registered because we can see the status of the instance is ready. So when we set the local listener parameter, the PMON process of the associated instance is able to dynamically register the instance with the local listener, even if the port is a non-default port, that is 1522. There is also another way to set this local listener parameter. Instead of putting the whole description of the listener, if we create a TNS entry that points to this listener with this description, we can also set the local listener to the TNS entry that we created. So let's check that example. We'll simply create one TNS entry in the tnsnames.ora file. Now I'll open the tnsnames.ora file that is located at the same Oracle Home Network Admin folder, and we will make an entry that points to the same local listener. You can put any name there, but here I am putting something like, say, my local listener, and that will point to, I'll simply copy the description of the listener here, and then I will save it. Now I'll just test this TNS entry that I just created, my local listener, using the TNS ping utility, and we see that it's working, and it took 0 milliseconds to connect. So, and connect to the instance as sys. So parameter local listener, here the whole description of the listener here, and we'll change it back to the TNS entry that we just created. So alter system set local listener equals to the TNS entry that we created is my local listener, scope both. Now if we check the status of our local listener, we will be able to see that the instance is already registered, but we want to make sure that this is working for the TNS alias that we just created. So we'll just restart the listener and check if PMON is able to dynamically register the instance after we made the change. So clear it, and we'll restart the listener. First stop it, then start it again, and it is not yet registered. Check the status again, and yes, now the listener has been up for more than 60 seconds since it was restarted, which is 1 minute 21 seconds. So the PMON process has got enough time to register the instance dynamically, and it did it, and we can see that the status is ready now. Now this is the ideal situation, and PMON process was able to dynamically register without any issues. But there are situations when, because of some issues or bugs, the PMON process is not able to dynamically register the instance with the listener. Even if we set the local listener parameter, then also this issue happens. In that case, we have another way to force the PMON to register the instance or the services under that instance with the listener by using a command, and that command is alter system register. So let's connect to the instance as sys, and issue the command alter system register. And it says the system altered, although it will make no difference because the instance was already registered dynamically and PMON process was able to do that. But still, just for information, this is our command in case of the PMON process is not able to dynamically register the instance with the listener. But please note that for this alter system register command to work, the local listener parameter must be set appropriately as mentioned before. Now what we have learned in today's tutorial is first the static registration, where information is hard-coded in the listener.ora and the instance status is unknown. And in case of dynamic registration, it is done by PMON process with the correct status of the instance. The port should be 1521 for automatic and dynamic registration of the instance by PMON. The local listener parameter should be set if the port is not 1521. And in case of any issues where the PMON process is not able to dynamically register the instance or the services, you can use the alter system register command to force the PMON to register the instance with the listener. So viewers, I hope you enjoyed the video and found it useful. Please hit the like button if you liked it and subscribe to my channel so you won't miss an episode in this series for the Oracle DBAs or similar educational videos that I am uploading every week.